Welcome to Tales That Terrify, the podcast that brings your darkest fears to life. Tonight we present 5 unsettling stories guaranteed to send shivers down your spine. From the shadows that whisper to the unknown lurking just beyond sight, each tale is crafted to haunt your imagination. Craving more nightmares? Visit our YouTube channel for even more terrifying tales, if you dare. Now, dim the lights, settle in, and brace yourself for this week's stories. It was supposed to be a peaceful escape. Just me, the stars, and the endless expanse of the New Mexico desert. I'd been camping alone before, and I loved the solitude, the way the silence wrapped around you like a blanket, broken only by the occasional rustle of wind through the sagebrush. But this trip was different. This trip would haunt me forever. I'd set up camp just before sunset, pitching my tent in a small clearing surrounded by jagged rock formations. The air was crisp, and the sky was a deep, inky blue, already dotted with the first few stars. I built a small fire, cooked a simple dinner, and sat by the flames, letting the warmth seep into my bones. By 10 p.m., I was exhausted. I doused the fire, climbed into my tent, and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The desert was quiet, too quiet now that I think about it. No crickets, no owls, not even the faintest whisper of wind, just silence. I fell asleep quickly, but something woke me at 2 a.m. sharp. A sound, a faint rhythmic scratching like nails dragging across the fabric of my tent. My eyes snapped open, and I lay perfectly still, straining to listen. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. It wasn't coming from one spot. It was everywhere, all around me, as if something was circling the tent, testing its boundaries. My heart pounded in my chest. I told myself it was an animal, a coyote, maybe, or a raccoon. But deep down, I knew better. Animals don't scratch like that. They don't move with such purpose. I reached for my flashlight, but before I could turn it on, the side of the tent bulged inward. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The fabric stretched, creaking under the pressure, and then I heard it, a loud guttural scraping sound, like claws raking against the nylon. The bulge grew larger, the tent wall bending almost to the ground. Something was pushing its way in. I fumbled with the flashlight, finally clicking it on, but the beam was weak, barely piercing the suffocating darkness. The bulge shifted, and I saw it, a long pointed object pressing against the tent, sharp and deliberate. It wasn't a branch, it wasn't an animal, it was something else. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. My first thought was a serial killer, some deranged lunatic who'd stumbled upon my campsite. But even as the thought crossed my mind, I knew it wasn't true. This was worse, much worse. I grabbed my knife, my hands shaking, and unzipped the tent door. The cold night air hit me like a slap, and I stepped outside, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. I expected to see a person, a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the empty clearing, bathed in pale moonlight. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a sheep, a lone, mangy sheep standing a few feet from my tent, its head lowered, its matted fur glistening in the moonlight. I almost laughed, relief flooding through me. Of course, a stupid sheep had wandered into my campsite and fallen asleep on my tent. That explained the scratching, the bulging, the scraping. I took a step closer, ready to shoo it away, but then it raised its head. Its eyes were wrong. Too large, too bright, glowing with an unnatural yellow light. And its mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, too wide for its face, filled with jagged, broken teeth. It stared at me, unblinking, and then it spoke. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice was guttural, wet, like it was choking on its own words. I stumbled backward, my knife slipping from my hand. The thing, took a step toward me, its movements jerky, unnatural. Its legs bent the wrong way, and its hooves scraped against the ground, leaving deep gouges in the dirt. I turned and ran, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I sprinted into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get away. The desert was a maze of shadows and rocks, and I tripped more than once, my hands scraping against the rough ground. Behind me I heard it, the sound of hooves pounding against the earth, faster and faster, gaining on me. I glanced over my shoulder and saw it, the thing, galloping on all fours, its body contorting and shifting as it moved. Its fur was falling off in clumps, revealing patches of raw, glistening flesh beneath. Its eyes burned brighter, and its smile widened, stretching almost to its ears. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out. I collapsed behind a boulder, pressing myself against the cold stone, trying to make myself as small as possible. The sound of hooves stopped, and for a moment there was silence. Then I heard it, a low, guttural laugh echoing through the night. "You can't hide from me." I clamped a hand over my mouth, stifling a sob. The flashlight was still clutched in my other hand, and I turned it off, plunging myself into darkness. I listened, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for the sound of hooves, for the thing to find me. But there was nothing, just the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Minutes passed, hours. I don't know how long I sat there, too terrified to move. The sky began to lighten, the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in shades of pink and orange. Slowly, cautiously, I peeked out from behind the boulder. The clearing was empty. My tent was still there, collapsed and torn, but there was no sign of the thing. No hoofprints, no fur, nothing. I stood on shaky legs and made my way back to the campsite, my eyes darting nervously around me. I packed up what was left of my gear as quickly as I could, my hands trembling so badly I could barely zip my backpack. I didn't look back as I hiked to my car. I didn't stop until I was on the highway, the desert shrinking in my rearview mirror. I told myself it was over, that I was safe, but deep down I knew better. Because that night as I drove away I heard it again, a faint guttural whisper coming from the back seat. "You can't run forever." And I knew, no matter how far I went, no matter where I hid, it would find me. It was only a matter of time. The party in the woods had been perfect at first. Laughter, music, the hum of neon lights strung between the trees. It was supposed to be a celebration, a few hours of reckless fun in the middle of nowhere. But then the sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the night like a knife. The flashing red and blue lights seeped through the trees, casting eerie glows on the dark trunks. "Shit! It's the cops!" Duane shouted above the music, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The crowd of people in their party clothes scattered like startled deer. Some people sprinted into the woods, while others froze, unsure what to do. I grabbed Duane's arm as he pulled me toward the edge of the clearing. "We need to go," I urged, my heart already hammering in my chest. We weren't even halfway through the woods when we heard the unmistakable crack of a flashlight beam snapping through the trees, followed by the urgent shouts of officers. A few seconds later, the sounds of footsteps, too many footsteps, echoed behind us. "Run!" Duane yelled, his grip tightening around my wrist as he pulled me deeper into the woods. I didn't hesitate, my feet pounding against the undergrowth as I followed him, panic rising in my chest like bile. The sound of the music still played faintly in the background, distorted now by the distance, but the steady thudding of our heartbeats was louder. I didn't want to look back. I couldn't. The thought of getting caught, of being hauled back to the party in handcuffs, terrified me more than I cared to admit. We ran. We pushed through the trees, their branches scraping at our skin, the leaves underfoot crinkling like bones with every step. I was gasping for breath, the cold air biting at my lungs, but I kept running. Duane didn't say anything. He just pulled me forward, his footsteps sure and steady. But I noticed something strange in his eyes. The urgency wasn't just fear, it was desperation. We had been running for what felt like an eternity when Duane abruptly stopped. I almost collided with him, stumbling as I tried to regain my balance. "What is it?" I asked, my voice shaky. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood there, staring into the darkness ahead. His eyes were wide, his breathing fast. I followed his gaze, straining to see in the thick shadows, but all I saw were more trees, more dark, dense forest. "Duane?" I said again, but this time my voice quivered with fear. Something wasn't right. He turned to face me. "There's something out here with us." The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't ask what he meant. I just felt it. Something cold in the air, something wrong about the night. The woods around us felt alive in a way that made my skin crawl, the trees whispering secrets I couldn't understand. Then came the sound, footsteps. Not from behind us, but ahead. Slow, deliberate steps that came from deep within the dark woods. My stomach twisted in fear. There was no mistaking it now. We weren't alone. "We have to keep moving," I whispered, but my voice felt weak, as though the forest itself was draining my strength. Duane didn't respond. He was staring at the trees, his eyes wide, filled with fear. His lips trembled, but he didn't speak. "Duane," I hissed, shaking his arm, but he was staring at something beyond the trees, his breath ragged. I turned to follow his gaze, my heart skipping a beat. There, in the shadows of the trees, was a figure. Tall and thin, barely visible but unmistakable. It was watching us, standing motionless, as if it had been there for ages. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it was something human, or something pretending to be human. "Duane," my voice cracked. "What is that?" "I don't know," he whispered, his eyes wide in terror. "But we have to get out of here." I didn't know what he meant. I didn't want to know. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, my senses screaming that we should have kept running. But there was nowhere to go now. The figure appeared again, this time closer. I could make out its features now, pale, gaunt skin stretched tight over its bones, hollow eyes glinting in the moonlight. Its fingers were impossibly long, curling and uncurling like twigs snapping in the wind. "Duane," my voice cracked. "What is that?" "I don't know," he whispered, his eyes wide in terror. "But we have to get out of here." Before I could ask what he meant, the creature lunged. I screamed, but the sound was drowned out by the deafening rustle of leaves and the snap of twigs breaking under its weight. It was faster than anything human could ever be, its long fingers reaching for us, its mouth opening wide in an unnatural grin. But before it could grab us, there was a sudden, powerful crack. The ground itself seemed to quake, as if the forest itself was angry at the intrusion. A low, guttural sound filled the air, and the creature froze. We didn't look back. We didn't wait to see what was happening behind us. Duane pulled me forward, dragging me through the underbrush with what little strength he had left. I didn't care if I tripped or stumbled. I just wanted to get away, to leave the woods behind us. But the sounds of the forest, the footsteps, the whispers, followed us. They never stopped. They never let us forget. I always thought camping alone in the wilderness was a great way to clear my mind. I had done it plenty of times before, but something about this trip felt off. The air was unnaturally still as I set up my tent, and the silence pressed against me like a suffocating blanket. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie, consuming quiet. The snow-covered pines surrounded my campsite, their branches hanging low under the weight of winter's grip. I had chosen this remote location for its solitude, but as night fell, I began to regret that decision. My fire crackled weakly, its glow barely pushing back the pressing darkness. And then I heard it. A howl. It wasn't the distant call of a lone wolf. No, this was closer. Too close. It echoed through the trees, a deep guttural sound that sent ice-cold fear down my spine. I gripped the hatchet I had brought along, my knuckles white. I had read about wolves in these parts, but they rarely attacked humans, unless they had reason. Then I saw them. Two glowing blue eyes piercing through the darkness beyond the trees. They didn't blink. They didn't waver. They simply watched. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, a curious predator passing through. But deep down, I knew better. Those eyes carried something else. Intelligence. Malice. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, making them groan like dying things. My fire flickered violently, sending shadows crawling across the snow. The eyes disappeared for a moment, but then I heard movement, crunching footsteps in the ice-laden underbrush. It was circling me. I forced myself to stand, my breath coming out in sharp white clouds. "Go away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. My words felt small, insignificant against the vast emptiness of the woods. Silence. Then the wolf stepped into the firelight. It was massive, larger than any wolf I had ever seen, its silver fur rippling with every movement. The firelight made its icy blue eyes gleam like twin orbs of frost, and when it bared its teeth, I swore I saw something. Wrong. Its fangs were too long, its lips curling in a way that seemed almost human. I staggered back, gripping the hatchet tighter. My instinct screamed at me to run, but I knew that was suicide. This wasn't a creature I could outrun. It wasn't a creature I could fight. The wolf growled low and deep, the sound vibrating through my chest. It took a step forward, then another, its breath visible in the frigid air. And then, to my horror, it did something no wolf should ever do. It spoke. "You shouldn't be here." My blood turned to ice. The voice was a low rasp, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakably real. My mind rebelled against it, refusing to accept what I had just heard. Wolves don't talk, animals don't talk, and yet this one had. I stumbled back toward my tent, my legs barely holding me upright. The wolf watched me, its head tilting slightly, as if amused. Then it lifted its head and let out another howl, this one far more haunting than the first. It echoed into the night, a sound that made every hair on my body stand on end, and something answered. Another howl, then another. They came from all around, surrounding me in an invisible cage of sound. My breath hitched. I wasn't dealing with just one of these things. There were more. The wolf took another step closer, and I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed my firewood and threw it into the flames, making the fire blaze higher. The sudden burst of light made the creature flinch, and for a brief moment I thought I saw something shift beneath its fur, something dark, writhing. Its lips curled in what might have been a snarl or a smile. Then it stepped back, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You don't belong here," it said again. "Leave, before the others arrive." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my backpack, barely stopping to zip it shut, and sprinted into the darkness. The howls followed me, weaving through the trees, growing closer. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing into the snow. My lungs burned, my heart a drumbeat against my ribs. I listened, waiting for the sound of pursuit, but there was nothing. Just the howling wind and the distant echo of something I would never be able to explain. I never went back to that campsite. I never even tried to find it again. And sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear the howls. I never believed in ghosts. I prided myself on being a rational person, someone who relied on facts and logic. But after what happened that night, reason became a distant memory, swallowed by the endless abyss of terror. It started with the scratching, a faint, rhythmic noise just outside my bedroom door. I dismissed it at first, assuming it was the old pipes or perhaps a branch tapping against the house. But the sound persisted, deliberate and measured, like nails dragging across wood. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I glanced at the clock, 3:12 a.m., too late for anything good. I took a deep breath and swung my legs over the side of the bed, feeling the cold wooden floor against my feet. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of settling beams. I stepped toward the door, hesitated, then reached for the knob. The scratching stopped. I exhaled, chuckling nervously. "Just my imagination," I muttered. But as I turned to go back to bed, the knob twisted violently beneath my fingers. A surge of panic shot through me. Someone was on the other side of the door. No, something. The knob rattled harder, the wood groaning under the pressure. Then came the whisper, a low, rasping voice. "Ethan, let me in." My breath caught in my throat. I stumbled backward, knocking over the bedside lamp. The bulb shattered, plunging the room into darkness. My hands fumbled for my phone, but it slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor. The door creaked open an inch. A sliver of blackness oozed through the gap, a void deeper than the night itself. Then came the fingers, long, skeletal, tipped with jagged black nails. They curled around the edge of the doorframe, gripping the wood with unnatural strength. I froze. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as the door slowly swung open. And then I saw it, a face unlike anything human. Gaunt, hollow-cheeked, with skin stretched too tight over an elongated skull, eyes like twin embers, glowing red in the dim light. A mouth too wide, filled with needle-sharp teeth, curled into a grotesque grin. "You left the door unlocked," it whispered, stepping forward. I scrambled back, my foot catching on the fallen lamp. I hit the floor hard, pain shooting up my spine. The creature slithered closer, its movements jerky yet impossibly fast. Its bony hands reached for me, fingers flexing with anticipation. In pure desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I kicked the door shut with every ounce of strength I had. The wood slammed against the creature's arm, eliciting a shriek so shrill it made my ears ring. The fingers twitched, then withdrew, retreating into the hallway's darkness. Silence. I lay on the floor, heart hammering. I barely dared to breathe. Seconds dragged into minutes. Then, slowly, the scratching began again, soft, patient. "Ethan, you can't keep me out forever." Tears burned in my eyes. I reached for my phone with trembling fingers, dialing 911, but as soon as I pressed the call button, the screen flickered and died. The room grew colder, and then the whisper came again, this time from inside the room. I found another way in. I've always been an outdoorsman, a lover of the wild. There's something about the untamed lands of the American West that speaks to me. Silent mountains, wide open plains, and star-filled skies. I'd spent years leading weekend camping trips, but this particular one was different. A group of us, friends from work, all in our mid-30s, seeking an escape from the grind of city life, had planned a trip out to a remote area in eastern Utah. The site we chose was tucked far off any main roads, a secluded patch of land surrounded by dense trees, the kind where the wind sounds like whispers and the darkness feels like it has weight. I'll never forget the way it felt the night we arrived. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the moon was a thin sliver in the sky. It was one of those nights where the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wildlife in the distance. But as the hours dragged on and the fire burned down to embers, the stillness became something else, a presence that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. We'd set up camp with little fanfare, just tents, sleeping bags, and an assortment of whiskey, beer, and marshmallows, the usual camping rituals. I had a sense of unease that night, something I couldn't shake, but I chalked it up to being out of my element. I wasn't used to being this far off the beaten path. Out here, you didn't have the safety net of other campers, the reassurance of nearby towns, or the hum of electricity. It was just the land, the stars, and us. Around 2 a.m., as I lay in my tent, trying to force myself to sleep, I heard it. A scream. It wasn't a normal scream. It wasn't the kind of scream you'd hear at a haunted house or in a bar fight. This scream was pure, raw terror. It split the night, reverberating through the air with a kind of desperate anguish that felt like it was coming from somewhere deep inside the earth itself. I shot up, heart hammering in my chest, breath coming in short gasps. I ripped open the zipper of my tent, not caring if I woke the others, and ran. My mind raced as I bolted through the dark, trying to orient myself in the unfamiliar terrain. I knew our tents were clustered near the fire pit, but it felt like the forest itself was closing in on me. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking like they were whispering secrets. The sound of the scream still echoed in my head, the voice, human, unmistakably human, dragging me forward with a force I couldn't resist. As I neared the row of tents, the screaming stopped. It wasn't a gradual fade either. 1 second the scream was there, cutting through the night air, and the next it was gone. Just gone, like it had been swallowed by the earth. A chill ran through me as I approached the tents, my feet barely making a sound on the cold ground. I expected to see someone, a figure lurking in the darkness, or maybe one of the others already awake and alarmed. But when I reached the site, there was only silence, the kind of silence that feels like it's pressing against your ears, thick and unnatural. I wasn't alone for long. My friends, John, Lisa, and Ben, arrived soon after, their faces pale in the moonlight, their eyes wide with confusion. Ben had been closest to the sound, having camped in the tent nearest the tree line. He was the first to speak, his voice low and strained. "Did anyone else hear that?" he asked, though we all knew the answer. Of course, we had. How could anyone miss it? "I thought it was one of the kids," Lisa said, her voice trembling. But that wasn't normal. That sounded like a grown man. We looked around at the row of tents. There were 4 in total, each one pitched closely together, Each tent was dark, the occupants no doubt asleep or too stunned to move. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though. The air felt wrong. Too still, too thick with something that didn't belong. I glanced at the others, but no one spoke. We all felt it. I moved quickly from tent to tent, waking each one of the campers. 4 adults, none of them much younger than me, all equally unsettled. Their faces were pale, eyes were clearly disturbed, but no one had seen anything, heard anything. None of them had moved, none of them had even stirred. The scream had been loud, bone-chilling, and yet they hadn't heard it. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. My pulse was hammering now, the hairs on the back of my neck standing straight. I couldn't explain it. There was no logical reason why the scream had stopped so suddenly, why it hadn't woken anyone else. The night dragged on, the uneasy silence never quite lifting. We all eventually crawled back into our tents, though none of us slept well. I could hear every rustle of the trees outside, every snap of a twig in the forest, as if the woods were alive with secrets. But the scream? It never came again. By morning, the sun rose bright and clear, but the unease lingered. We packed up our gear quietly, the incident from the night before hanging in the air like a dark cloud. We didn't speak much. Maybe we were all hoping it had been some kind of shared nightmare, a figment of our collective imagination, something that could be explained away by the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the wilderness, or the drinks we'd had before bed. But none of us could shake the feeling that something had been out there in the dark, something we couldn't explain, and something we had no business encountering. When we finally made it back to the main road, the town was a mere 2-hour drive away, but it felt like a different world. The land behind us, untouched, vast, and silent, was like a memory that refused to fade. It wasn't until we were halfway back, crossing the barren stretches of Utah, that Ben finally spoke what we had all been thinking. "I know what I heard," he said, his voice hoarse. "It wasn't some animal. That wasn't natural." "No, it wasn't," I agreed, my throat dry. I could still hear it in my head, the scream, the desperation, the silence afterward. "I don't know if we'll ever understand what happened," Lisa said, her eyes on the road, but I could tell her mind was still out there, in the dark, in the woods. We didn't return to that site. We didn't talk about it much after that day either. The few words we exchanged about it only confirmed what we already knew. There was something out there, something old, something patient, something that doesn't care for human presence. And I swear to this day, sometimes when I'm alone in the woods, I can still hear it. That scream. Not far off, just close enough to make my skin crawl. And that concludes this week's chilling journey into the unknown. We hope these tales have left you looking over your shoulder and questioning the darkness around you. Craving more horror? Subscribe to our YouTube channel for even more terrifying tales. Until next time, remember, there are always more nightmares waiting to be told.